Okay, guys, we are going to now get started with the lesson. Today's lesson is going to be basically it's an extension of the last lesson we covered, which had to do with the basic principles of American democracy. Um, Now that we kind of identified and defined what the principles of our nation's democracy is based upon, now what we're going to do is move on and look at the actual details of the Constitution, which breaks down onto six basic principles. So we're not going to look at how our nation's government is, what the actual principles of our nation's government are. Okay, the very first principle. Our Constitution is built upon this idea of popular sovereignty. And essentially what that means, it means a couple of things. First, the word popular is important because it defines for us the idea that our government and the people are linked as one. The body of people that make up our nation essentially represents our nation. So in the United States, our Constitution is basically holds to the idea that people are essentially the only source of government power. Without the people, then the government doesn't exist. Likewise, political power also belongs to the people. And this is important because in some other countries where you find a very centralized government, some examples would be like a dictatorship. In those countries, political power would belong to only one person, that would be specifically the leader. However, in the United States, according to the Constitution, all political power, which means the power to create your laws, the power to enforce your laws, the power to evaluate your laws and to revise and change those laws, that all belongs to the people. The third important point about popular sovereignty is that because the people provide the power for the government, essentially the government can only govern with the consent of the people. And that's an important principle because what it does is that it creates a limitation on how much power the government can have and exercise over the nation. Basically, the people would be the ones to provide approval on all measures. So, in the end, the government can only do what the people allow it to do. And we'll talk about basically some of the limitations to this because of the fact that we can see in past history how our government has done many things. Where, for example, we've allowed for slavery to have taken place in the United States for a long time. We had Jim Crow laws to take place. We've had a lot of unconstitutional laws that have existed, and people have asked, how is it possible that a law can remain in effect even though it's been directly in contradiction to the Constitution and be declared unconstitutional later on down the road? How can we do that? And it's really simple, and that's because the people allowed it to happen. So in those examples, popular sovereignty can sometimes backfire. And when we've had a racist population, they've given consent to the government to allow for those kinds of laws to take place. However, the more the population is educated and the more the population becomes aware of certain things, then really the population is allowed and is given the control to essentially pull the plug. So remember that the government can only govern under the consent of the people. And that's something that's very important. Okay, the second principle is that our Constitution is based on the idea of separating power. Okay, and this is related to what we talked about in the last section about the heritage of our government coming from original British documents during the colonial era. So keep in mind that there's been a long evolution where power was once centralized under a monarchy. Eventually, over time, the absolute rule of the king had eroded away to eventually become shared with a larger governing body where power over time becomes broken down into different branches and also is shared with the people. That evolution, the final stage of the evolution we see in the United States. Because of the fear, think about the reasons why we broke away from England, because we believe that too much power was concentrated in the hands of a monarchy, and so as a result, the colonies broke away. So that fear of centralized power led to the separation of power in the Constitution. And so now we've got three distinct branches. Many of you guys know already we have the legislative, executive, and judicial. And just to be a little bit more specific, again, and this is probably a review for most of you guys, but I just want to go over this, and that is that the legislative branch is represented by specifically Congress. That is our lawmaking body. Congress is bicameral, meaning it is made up of two different houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive branch is represented by the President. That is the law enforcing arm of our government. And finally, we have the third branch, the judicial, made up of the Supreme Court and the rest of the court system. So basically, the court system is what will interpret the laws. Okay, the third principle is this idea of checks and balances. So we not only divided power up in three different ways. Every branch is considered equal in power. Every branch has its own responsibilities. There is no branch, none of the branches overlap in terms of any shared responsibilities or powers. So each branch, as a result, is held to certain constitutional restraints. Here are some examples. We have a lot of cases in history where Congress and the President go head-to-head. And that's because Congress can be basically blocked by the President. At the same time, the President can block Congress. For example, when Congress proposes a bill, if it successfully gets through Congress, it will have to finally be approved by the President. And the President can stop it by vetoing. Likewise, if a President provides a bill, it can get killed in Congress because it doesn't meet the minimum required votes. So the battle could go back and forth. Same thing between the President versus the Supreme Court. The President can make an executive decision, and later on down the road, that can be challenged by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can declare the presidential action to either be constitutional or unconstitutional. And then finally, what we've seen most commonly taking place is when Congress has made laws, and then that gets blocked by the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court may declare something unconstitutional. Now, really in these cases, it seems that many people have argued that the Supreme Court may have the most amount of power, but really it is equal. However, the main power that, for example, that the President or Congress can have over the Supreme Court would be in the appointment of individuals to represent the Supreme Court and also the impeachment of those individuals. So here's a diagram just to kind of illustrate what I sort of explained, the idea of how in all the different directions how checks and balances can take place between the three branches of government. For example, again, like I just mentioned, let's take a look at the executive branch and the judicial branch. So the President can appoint judges to the courts. However, the judicial branch, in return, the courts can declare acts by the President to be unconstitutional, like I just mentioned. Again, you'll see the same process between the Congress and the courts, where Congress would have to approve of any of the presidential appointments through a confirmation process. At the same time, the courts can declare any laws made by Congress as unconstitutional. So everything I just explained, you can see here visually. It's the exact same thing. Okay, the next principle of our Constitution is the idea of judicial review, and this is talking about essentially the power of our judiciary branch, the Supreme Court and the lower courts. Now, the very first case of judicial review, and what that basically means is when the Supreme Court reviews either a decision made by the president or reviews a law that has been passed by Congress and it's been challenged, and this is reviewed by the Supreme Court. So we call that process judicial review. The very first case of judicial review happened in 1803, called Marbury versus Madison. And basically, I'm not going to talk about the details of the court trial. However, what you need to know is it had to do with lower level appointments made by the president and the confirmation required by Congress, and that had been done unconstitutionally. And so eventually, this made its case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally made it a declaration by reviewing that case. And by doing that, what they did was they established this idea called setting a precedent. So today, when judicial review takes place at the Supreme Court, a precedent is set, which basically means a new law has been created without it actually being written in the Constitution. A good example that we'll talk about later on would be like abortion in Roe versus Wade. We don't have a specific abortion law, however, and it's not written anywhere in the Constitution. However, it is considered to be totally constitutional to be given the right to have an abortion. So judicial review, basically what they're doing is as they're reviewing some kind of a challenge to a decision or a law, they're basically applying the Constitution and they're interpreting how would the Constitution look at that particular case. And would it be considered contradictory, or does the Constitution actually affirm what just took place? And so as the Constitution is being interpreted and being applied to whatever has been challenged, the Supreme Court can then declare if something is essentially legal or illegal. So whenever we say unconstitutional, basically what that means is it is any law or any decision or any action made by the president that is in direct contradiction to the Constitution of the United States. And any time that happens, it's essentially illegal, and we will call that unconstitutional. So, going back to the idea of how the judicial branch, it's been argued that the judicial branch really has more power than the other two branches. The reason why that has been brought up is because of we've seen in history, oftentimes when with racism taking place, if the president is racist, this is an example which has happened in the past, and he appoints Supreme Court justices that are also racist, that share the same views, and at the same time you have a racist Congress that confirms those appointments by the president. Now you've got Supreme Court judges that are racist, and they will interpret the Constitution with their racist bias. And that's kind of how we have allowed slavery and Jim Crow laws to have taken place for so long in the United States, even though it directly contradicts the Constitution, because the law, not only the lawmakers, but the law interpreters were racist themselves. And the problem is that the Supreme Court justices, once they are appointed, they can continue to sit on the bench and serve in the Supreme Court for life. And they can basically sit until they either pass away or they decide to resign or retire. So essentially, that creates a problem where if you do have the wrong people appointed, then you also have these issues with laws that might not necessarily be constitutional. We see this happening if justices are extremely religious. In the end, the problem with judicial review and the judicial branch is that it is usually impossible for these people to be 100% impartial and completely fair. In many cases, justices will have some type of a bias, and they will either lean towards a conservative idea or they will lean more toward a liberal slant. Sorry guys, my voice is going away, so you guys are going to have to bear with me. But we are almost done, and I am sorry I am boring you guys to death. Okay, the next idea of our government, the principle is based on federalism. And that basically is our system of government here. Power is distributed on a territorial basis. We have power physically separated, where we have a national federal government, Washington, D.C., and then we also have power in the states, where the power resides in the capitals. And so you have all the states have separate powers that they are assigned and given responsibilities, and then you have our federal government, Washington, D.C., with its own powers, and then you also have a few shared responsibilities. So there's always historically been this battle between the national government and the independent states. Some roles and responsibilities are very clear that the national government will have no say in, and that the states are completely independent and can do what they want. An example would be education or marriage. The problem is the national government will often step in when they feel state governments create laws that may be interpreted as being unconstitutional. For example, when we talk about marriage, specifically the idea of gay marriage, or when we talk about education, in the past we had segregated education. So in those times, the national government stepped in the attempt to override the individual states. One thing that we've learned, though, in the United States, and it's kind of an unwritten rule, an unwritten principle, is that despite the idea of federalism and that power being divided, in the end, the federal government, the national government, Washington, D.C., oftentimes will have the final say. So basically, again, power is divided among central governments and regional powers or state governments. And then there are some shared responsibilities like commerce and trade and taxation. Alright guys, so that was, I know I bored the heck out of you guys. I apologize. I hope you guys will forgive me for that. Sorry guys. But anyway, hopefully what I explained made sense. And the lesson, hopefully it did not kill you. It's short enough here where later on I can, when I come back, we can go over some questions that you guys might have. And that's it. So thank you. And hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow. That's it. Okay, let me turn this off.